Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. If you could please welcome Pamela Chadden. Ladies and gentlemen, Pamela Chadden with the Chamber Orchestra of the Strings. Following this evening's time with Stephen Galloway, Pamela will return with Robin Kessinger to close the evening with a sonata for cello and piano. Following that musical ending, we will then have our book signing outside with Stephen. My name is Sean Anglum. I'm the engagement specialist for programs and outreach with the Pikes Peak Library District, and we want to thank you for coming tonight for yet another in our programs for All Pikes Peak Reads for 2013. We are so gratified that you're here and so happy that we can have Stephen Galloway with us tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Executive Director for Pikes Peak Library District, Paula Miller.
Good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Pikes Peak Library District to welcome you here this evening. This is a central event in our All Pikes Peak Reads program, our all community reading program that we do every October around this time of year. And it's very gratifying to see people here. One of our major goals for the Library District is to be able to bring readers and writers together. To have an opportunity to actually hear from the author of the books that we present, and that hopefully makes for wonderful discussion for you as well. So on behalf of the Library District and all libraries nationwide, as well as educational institutions like Colorado College, thank you for being readers and being here. This is our second year of close collaboration with Colorado College, and I want to thank them for that wonderful collaboration and this beautiful venue here this evening to host our author. This is also the second year in a row that we have featured a Canadian author, so quite wonderful for us, and the second year in a row that we have representation from the Canadian Consul here this evening. So it's my pleasure to introduce her to you this evening. Ladan Amariz, I know, practiced this before. Ladan Amirazizi is here this evening with us. She is the Consul, Senior Trade Commissioner, and Foreign Affairs Program Manager. Ladan arrived in Denver in September 2009. As Consul, she manages both the trade and political programs for the Consulate General of Canada for Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Montana, and Kansas, facilitating trade investment, innovation, and advocating Canadian interests in our Rocky Mountain region. Prior to that, she had been working with the Latin America and Caribbean region for over 10 years for the Government of Canada, as Deputy Director for Central America and the Caribbean, Trade Commissioner in the Mexico Division, and Trade Advisor at a regional office in Montreal. From 2002 to 2003, she served as CIDA Inc. Program Manager at the Canadian International Development Agency to help grow the private sector in developing countries. Ladan has had two other experiences working abroad, at the Embassy of Canada in Montevideo, Uruguay, and more recently she spent 3 years working as Trade Commissioner at the Embassy of Canada in Santiago, Chile. As a student, she also lived in France and Spain. Ladan graduated from the University of Ottawa in 1996 with a Bachelor of Commerce specialization in International Management and Marketing, and she has a graduate certificate in e-commerce from McGill University. As an aside, she's fluent in English, French, Spanish, and Farsi. Please help me welcome this evening Ladan Amirazizi.
Good evening and bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. I'll leave it at 2 languages for now as representation for Canada. But thank you very much for inviting us and being part of this All Pikes Peak Reads program, which is a really interesting one, especially since it is the second year running with Canadian authors. In fact, this has been a really great week for Canadian authors. You might have heard that Alice Munro won the Nobel Prize. And of course, this morning we had Eleanor Catton win the Man Booker Prize. So I don't know if that was a great coincidence or if it was planned that way, but that's been fantastic. And of course, it is our great pleasure to have Steve Galloway here, who is amongst the same caliber of the other two authors that I just mentioned. And for us, being the consulate here in Colorado, we already see a lot of ties between Canada and Colorado. And it's great to see how arts is also another way that we're strengthening our relationships between this region and Canada. We share the strong connections in Canadians in Colorado. I've met a few tonight. How many are you are Canadian? Steve, I know, Steve and Steve, they can put their hand up. Okay, we met a few other ones. But we also share a lot of our similar values. We have fundamental beliefs in freedom and democracy and human rights. And the wartime theme of Mr. Galloway's book reminds us also of the vital importance of the Canada-Colorado military relationship. As I'm sure you know, with the presence of NORAD here in your backyard, we have a strong and long-standing relationship in peace and security, and we have been working seamlessly together since 1958. And it's a relationship that continues to grow. Both President Obama and Prime Minister Harper are dedicated to seeing this wonderful Canada-US relationship continue to strengthen on many different levels. We have the Beyond the Border Action Plan that is looking to see more seamless and more secure border protection between our two countries. And that way we can continue seeing this exchange of people, of culture, of goods and services. Canada is by far Canada's largest trading partner, about $2 billion in exports sold last year. And perhaps a little appropriate to say this evening, and hopefully this will be the end of it, but we understand about 18.5% of those in Colorado Springs have been affected by the furlough of the government. And so with the number of Canadians who are contributing to the local economy, about 100,000, we're thinking that we're helping with your local economy as well. So on that note, I just wanted to introduce Dr. Stephen Hayward, who is originally from Toronto and currently an associate professor in the English department of Colorado College. He holds a doctorate in Renaissance Studies and has published scholarly essays on Shakespeare and Canadian literature. Stephen also contributes to the Wall Street Journal, Canada's Globe and Mail, which is our largest newspaper, and the Literary Reviews of Canada. He has authored multiple award-winning books, as I mentioned. This is a great week for Canadian authors, including Buddha Stevens and Other Stories and The Secret Mitzvah of Lucho Burke. And the Canadian national best-selling novel, Don't Be Afraid. Now, I would love to hear more about some essays on gangster movies I've heard about. That sounds really interesting as well. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Steve to come and introduce our other author. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. This is great. It's the second year of our All Pikes Peak Reads. I wish I could say All Canadian All Pikes Peak Reads, but you know, it's early days yet. I would like to thank the consulate for being here. And Ladin, I don't know if you know this, has a bit of a history with singing the national anthem in the United States of America, where her name, which is, you'll admit, a challenging name to pronounce, was mispronounced by the announcer who just simply introduced her as Lady Zaza. And thank you, Lady Zaza, for being here. Every so often you get to introduce a consul from the consulate, but never a Lady Zaza. It's kind of amazing. So if you stay long enough, well, maybe something will happen. I don't want to put her on the spot, but it's wonderful to have the consulate here and to have their continued support of Canadian Studies programming here at Colorado College. And as Ladon says, as Paula says, it's a terrific week for literature in Canada. It used to be, I often say that saying that someone is a Canadian author, as I'm going to be saying in a second about a Canadian writer, Stephen Galloway, it's like saying, it's like pronouncing someone, like I would often talk about myself as being the tallest member of my family, which is true, but nothing to brag about. Often we use Canadian author as a qualifier rather than an intensifier, as you do when you say an American writer. And I think there may have been a time in Canadian history, Canadian literary history, when we felt inferior to the two great traditions of literature and culture that we grew up being surrounded by, American and British. And I think that that time has passed. And I think we see a clear testament to that in the great work of Stephen Galloway. And the continued work, the Canadian-American partnership has been important in the past, and it's going to be more important in the future. It used to be that we were able to say that is the longest unguarded border in the world. We can't say that anymore, but I hope we can say it again at some point. And I want to thank the Pikes Peak Library District for their partnership. It's been terrific these last couple of years working with Paula, and this year working with Sean, who has worked tirelessly to put this program in place. And it takes a great deal of vision, it takes a great deal of faith to put on 2 Canadian books in a row in an all city reads situation. And let me tell you, there are many American cities who do not do that. There are many American cities who would never contemplate doing that. And I think it's no accident that the Pikes Peak Library District does that within a context which, of course, we look up every day at that mountain where NORAD is. And we know that it is a joint command, a Canadian-American command. And I think that's representative of the things that we value in this community and the future of this community, when we have this kind of commitment, not just politically, not just militarily, but culturally. And culture is key. And I want to thank you for that, Paula. And I want to acknowledge the hard work of the great Sean and Gellum here, who's wearing the same jacket as I am today, as if we're in the same band, which I guess we are. It's an awful thing to show up at a reading and find yourself wearing the same jacket as someone else. But it happened. But he's worked tirelessly. And lastly, I want to just say, I want to acknowledge the incredible effort that was put on the site. They're not here from the English department here at Colorado College, most particularly our department secretary, Paula Pine, who is absolutely instrumental in making this happen. She's not here, but she did so much of the work, and you should know that. And of course, to say that Pamela Chadden for that incredible performance, moving, and thank you so much for being here. Another round of applause for her. In the spring of 1992, it is the spring of 1992, and Vedran Smalovic, former principal cellist of the Sarajevo Symphony Orchestra, witnesses the death of about 22 people. They are standing in a bread line when a mortar shell descends upon them. The following day, he puts on his tuxedo and goes out into the street, sitting with his cello in the crater left by the explosion, and he begins to play. He does the same thing for the next 22 days, one day for each victim of the attack. Mournful and defiant, at once conveying the redemptive power of art and the brutality of war, the image of the Cellist of Sarajevo has since captured the imagination of many contemporary artists, among them the great Canadian writer Stephen Galloway. Now, I've lived with the book Cellist of Sarajevo for a number of years now, and my first acquaintance with this great novel occurred in, I believe, February 2008, before the book was published. And I have here the proof that was sent to me by the Globe and Mail in Canada, Canada's national newspaper, to review. And I remember when I got the call from Martin Levin, the editor at the time, saying, I wonder if you would mind, I wonder if you'd be interested, he said. I think that was the name. I think he said, would you mind? Would you be interested in reviewing The Cellist of Sarajevo by Stephen Galloway? Now, I knew Stephen as a writer. I'd never met him, which is why I was the only person in Canada who did not know Stephen Galloway. And I say that, I say that to be funny, but it's actually true. Stephen he directs the creative writing program at the University of British Columbia, which is the largest creative writing program in Canada. He is a person who is universally known, it seems, for his wit, his good humor, for being insanely agreeable, and just being an all-around good guy. I said, "Do you know Stephen Galloway, Martin?" I said, "I don't know him." He said, "Well, Cellist of Sarajevo, I'm going to put it in the mail to you." And I remember that there was a moment of hesitation, in which more than a moment, there was some serious hesitation on my part after I put down the phone thinking, I'm going to review this book called The Cellist of Sarajevo by Stephen Galloway, who I was pretty sure had an imaginative attachment to the Siege of Sarajevo. And I knew that this was a book that questions would be asked about. I knew this was a difficult book. I knew this was a difficult book about a difficult subject. And at the same time as I admired Stephen Galloway, who had published, by the way, 2 novels already, the hockey novel Finney Walsh, and the novel called Ascension, which when it came out, I remember people telling me, this is true, they'd say, like, "Have you read Ascension by Stephen Galloway? It's good." And Stephen and I are about the same age, we're from the same country, and I want to say, like, I'm all for a Canadian artistic production, I'm all for the emergence of a Canadian literary tradition, but when you have another Canadian writer about your age and doing some good work, it makes you nervous. You don't want to encourage it too. You want to encourage it really. He's like, I said, "Oh, that's great." And they say, no. Ascension is a very, very good novel. I was thinking, all right, well, let's see this Cellist of Sarajevo. Now, one of the strange things about a novel, one reviews novels in this line of work. And there are books that you get, and you don't really like them sometimes. You have a decision to make, and sometimes that decision is how mean of a review to what do you do in that? Then you get more often, you get a book that you really, really like, a profound book, a good book. You say, "Oh, I'll give it a good review." And then there are books that you like so much, that touch you so deeply, that you feel, I must write this review as if I'm taking revenge for the author, as if this is a personal business. I must write this review. And it's a curious thing to go back and to see some 6-7 years later what I wrote about it. And I wrote this. As novels about Sarajevo go, I don't normally read reviews of books when I do my introductions, but since I wrote this review, I figured it was legit. It's one thing to own a novel that you've written 7 years ago. It's another thing to own a review. As novels about Sarajevo go, The Cellist of Sarajevo is perhaps notable for the extent... sorry, that's the wrong part. Galloway's triad of characters is nearly Dickensian in its formal precision. Dragan is the ghost of Sarajevo past, Keenan of Sarajevo's future. Arrow shows us the horror and the hope of Sarajevo's present. But what is most impressive about this ambitious and exquisitely wrought novel is its ability to uncover and render with admirable power the effective realities of what it must have been like to live in Sarajevo during the time of the siege. This is an incredible imaginative effort. This is a humane and a deeply moving novel. Stephen Galloway.
I'm not expecting a call, I'm a rambler, so I'm putting this timepiece there so that I will know when to stop my rambling. I feel like I've just been eulogized. Now I have to talk lower. I should be being lowered into the ground about now. Let me start by thanking everyone who was involved in bringing me here. I've never felt more like a Canadian writer than I have in Colorado Springs. Normally I don't think of myself that way. I don't think I'm Canadian. I'm just some guy who writes books, and I feel strangely proud right now. Who was the other? Oh, it was Margaret. That's all right. Margaret. Okay, yeah. I was once in a sauna in Moose Jaw, and and enjoying myself greatly. And then Margaret Atwood came in, and I had one of the most surreal experiences of my life. If you ever get a chance to take a sauna with Margaret Atwood and her husband, I recommend it. I recommend it. Interesting. Particularly thanks to Stephen and Sean, who have been looking after my unreasonable demands this week. Sean took me to buy a banjo. I did my part for your local economy. I purchased a very nice banjo, which you cannot get in Vancouver. It's not a banjo place. So it's been a lot of fun. What I'm going to do this evening is I'm going to read a little bit of the book and talk and read and talk, and I think then we'll take some questions, and then Pamela will be back to play some more. So that is the shape of our evening. One of my unreasonable demands was water. That was actually my only one so far. It's flavored. Okay, I'm gonna start. So this is just the beginning. It screamed downward, splitting air and sky without effort. A target expanded in size, brought into focus by time and velocity. There was a moment before impact that was the last instant of things as they were. Then the visible world exploded. In 1945, an Italian musicologist found 4 bars of a sonata's bass line in the remnants of the firebombed Dresden Music Library. He believed these notes were the work of the 17th century Venetian composer Tommaso Albinoni, and spent the next 12 years reconstructing a larger piece from the charred manuscript fragment. The resulting composition, known as Albinoni's Adagio, bears little resemblance to most of Albinoni's work and is considered fraudulent by most scholars. But even those who doubt its authenticity have difficulty denying the Adagio's beauty. Nearly half a century later, it's this contradiction that appeals to the cellist. That something could be almost erased from existence in the landscape of a ruined city, and then rebuilt until it is new and worthwhile, gives him hope. A hope that now is one of a limited number of things remaining for the besieged citizens of Sarajevo, and that, for many, dwindles each day. And so today, like every other day in recent memory, the cellist sits beside the window of his second-floor apartment and plays until he feels his hope return. He rarely plays the Adagio. Most days, he's able to feel the music rejuvenate him as simply as if he were filling a car with gasoline. But some days, this isn't the case. If, after several hours, this hope doesn't return, he will pause to gather himself, and then he and his cello will coax Albinoni's Adagio out of the firebombed husk of Dresden and into the mortar-pocked, sniper-infested streets of Sarajevo. By the time the last few notes fade, his hope will be restored. But each time he's forced to resort to the Adagio, it becomes harder, and he knows its effect is finite. There are only a certain number of Adagios left in him, and he will not recklessly spend this precious currency. It wasn't always like this. Not long ago, the promise of a happy life seemed almost inviolable. 5 years ago at his sister's wedding, he posed for a family photograph, his father's arm slung behind his neck, fingers grasping his shoulder. It was a firm grip, and to some it would have been painful, but to the cellist it was the opposite. The fingers on his flesh told him that he was loved, that he had always been loved, and that the world was a place where, above all else, the things that were good would find a way to burrow into you. Though he knew all of this then, he would give up nearly anything to be able to go back in time and slow down that moment, if only so he could more clearly recall it now. He would very much like to feel his father's hand on his shoulder again. He can tell today won't be an Adagio day. It has been only a half hour since he sat down beside the window, but already he feels a little bit better. Outside, a line of people wait to buy bread. It's been over a week since the markets had any bread to buy, and he considers whether he might join him. Many of his friends and neighbors are in line. He decides against it, for now. There's still work to do. It screamed downward, splitting air and sky without effort. A target expanded in size, brought into focus by time and velocity. There was a moment before impact. That was the last instant of things as they were. Then the visible world exploded. When the mortars destroyed the Sarajevo Opera Hall, the cellist felt as if he were inside the building, as if the bricks and glass that once bound the structure together became projectiles that sliced and pounded into him, shredding him beyond recognition. He was the principal cellist of the Sarajevo Symphony Orchestra. That was what he knew how to be. He made the idea of music an actuality. When he stepped on stage in his tuxedo, he was transformed into an instrument of deliverance. He gave to the people who came to listen what he loved most in the world. He was as solid as the vice of his father's hand. Now, he doesn't care whether anyone hears him play or not. His tuxedo hangs in the closet, untouched. The guns perched on the hills surrounding Sarajevo have dismantled him, just as they have the opera hall, just as they have his family home in the night while his father and mother slept, just as they will, eventually, everything. The geography of the siege is simple. Sarajevo is a long ribbon of flat land surrounded on all sides by hills. The men on the hills control all the high ground and one peninsula of level ground in the middle of the city. They fire bullets and mortars and tank shells and grenades into the rest of the city, which is being defended by one tank and small handheld weapons. The city is being destroyed. The cellist doesn't know what is about to happen. Initially, the impact of the shell won't even register. For a long time, he'll stand at his window and stare. Through the carnage and confusion, he'll notice a woman's handbag soaked in blood and sparkled with broken glass. He won't be able to tell whom it belongs to. Then, he'll look down and see he has dropped his bow on the floor, and somehow it will seem to him that there's a great connection between these two objects. He won't understand what the connection is, but the feeling that it exists will compel him to undress, walk to the closet, and pull the dry cleaner's plastic from his tuxedo. He will stand at the window all night and all through the next day. Then, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, 24 hours after the mortar fell on his friends and neighbors while they waited to buy bread, he will bend down and pick up his bow. He will carry his cello and stool down the narrow flight of stairs to the empty street. The war will go on around him as he sits in the small crater left at the mortar's point of impact. He'll play Albinoni's Adagio. He'll do this every day for 22 days, a day for each person killed. Or at least he'll try. He won't be sure he will survive. He won't be sure he has enough adagios left. The cellist doesn't know any of this now as he sits in his window in the sun and plays. He isn't yet aware, but it's already on its way. It screams downward, splitting air and sky without effort. A target expands in size, brought into focus by time and velocity. There is a moment before impact that is the last instant of things as they are. Then the visible world explodes. So that is the opening of the novel. Stephen was correct in his initial suspicion that I have no business writing a book about the siege of Sarajevo in a way. I'm from Vancouver, Canada. I'm Scots-Irish, and no one has ever fired a gun at me, and I'm very hopeful that that continues to be the case. In May of 1992, sort of when the war in Sarajevo was beginning, I didn't know very much, if anything, about Sarajevo at all. I knew where it was on the map, and I knew what any one of us would have known at that time, which is that we may have remembered watching the Olympics there in 1984. And we may remember from our history books that that was ostensibly where World War I began, when our Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Beyond that, I had nothing. And that was fine by me. And then I was in the, I don't remember where I was. I was in a waiting room somewhere and flipping through the magazines as one does. And I came across a photograph of Vedran Smilovic, the person that this bit I just read is based on. And it was a photograph of him sitting in Vasy Miskina, the street where it happened, playing. And the thing about this photograph is it's impossible to look at it amorally. There is an enormous range of possible reaction to it. What you see when you look at it is a man in a tuxedo, and I think we can all agree tuxedo is a pretty snappy looking outfit, but the tuxedo's dirty, his beard is terribly kept, his hair is wild, he's clearly lost weight. He looks about as bad as you can look while wearing a tuxedo. But he's playing a cello, which is the most visually beautiful. You don't even have to really play a cello to think it's great. You can just have one sitting there and look at it, right? It's just a stunning visual thing, regardless of what it sounds like, which is also magnificent. But then on the other hand, he's sitting in the middle of a street where the pavement is blown up, the windows behind him are blown out, and it's clearly not the place one normally sees cellists. So immediately when you look at this picture, you're sort of, you can't nothing it. You can, however, have a pretty wide range of reactions to it. There's on one hand, the notion that, what is this idiot doing? This is not a place to play your cello. Are you going to stop the war playing your cello in the street? Are you really so Pollyanna-ish, you fool? And then on the other side, there's, this is one of the most humane expressions of what it means to be a person and how wrong war can be that you could possibly ever see. And then anything sort of in the middle. In researching the book, I talked to, if you talk to 100 people in Sarajevo, you get 103 opinions about Vedran Smilovic and why he did what he did. And that to me was extremely interesting. But in terms of writing a book, it's a terrible story for a book in and of itself, because what he did on the first day, which I read to you, he does 22 more times without change. And it's hard to string a story on that. Like, what are you going to do on day 18, right? Like, yep, he did it again. It was pretty much the same, still good, right? You're still good. So you couldn't do anything really with it as a writer. And then after September 11th, we began to debate in the Western world the relative merits of going to war in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And there's a funny thing, like people often ask you as a writer where you get your ideas for books or why you wrote a particular book. And I think it's this way for me, and I think it's this way for a lot of writers, is you don't really get to pick what books you write. You become so kind of obsessed, you get something in your craw, and the only way you can kind of function as a human being is to start writing about it. It's sort of your method for understanding the world. And at that time, what I did not understand about the world is how we could have a debate whether we were for war or against it without having the major part of the discussion be the fact that in contemporary warfare, 90 to 98% of casualties are civilian. This is a fact. This isn't in dispute by anyone. And these civilians aren't bad guy civilians. They're butchers. They're school teachers. They're people like us who just happen to live where this war is going on. And we've developed this phrase collateral damage to not talk about that. So what I began to think about was, what would it be like if my city were the one being bombed or under siege or whatever was about to happen in all of these places. Maybe it was a reasonable thing to happen, but how would it affect me? And what came back to me then was this picture of the Cellist of Sarajevo. And what I began to think about and then continue to think about was to what extent do actions like this influence people when they are under these pressures? When your world falls apart around you, right? When the water stops running, the electricity goes off, the sort of social structures that are in place cease to exist, and when you are literally at most moments in your life in danger of your life being over at any moment for entirely indiscriminate reasons, how do you still engage with the world? What do you do to survive? And do things like what the Cellist of Sarajevo did make any difference, or do people just ignore it? Was this just a case of, artists are going to do what they're going to do, People ask, why do you think he played in the street? Because he's a cellist. What do you expect him to do? Is my answer. That's what he does. Whether it's effective or not is a secondary. Like, you didn't think he was going to take his cello and go up in the hills and start whacking guys with it. He was going to play the cello at every possible opportunity. The same as in a war, I would probably write about it. And, a painter would paint about it, and a filmmaker would make a film about it. But the question is, what does what he did going into the world do? And yeah, I think I'll read a bit more before I'll talk more about that. But that sort of became the central question for these three characters, these three fictional characters that populate the novel. Let's read from Arrow. Yeah, let's do that. So Arrow, sorry, I'm going to ineptly. I see writers who can just seamlessly drink their water while talking. It's very impressive, and I have not mastered it. I actually make it worse by drawing attention to the fact that I'm not mastering it. Okay, so Arrow is a young woman who, like many young women in the former Yugoslavia, is good with a gun. Compulsory military service was there for everyone. Before you went to university, you did I can't remember if it was a year or two, but you did a stint of compulsory military service. So Arrow, when the war broke out, her father had been a police officer, and she found herself sort of not conscripted, but recruited, there's the word, recruited to be a sniper in defense of the city. And she's ended up, it turns out, being an unusually good one. She possesses, as these things go, a gift for sending a bullet from one location to the other. So she has been tasked with protecting the cellist from the men in the hills who have decided to make a special target for him. In the part I'm going to read, she has been doing this for some time, and the day before, she almost was killed. She's been hiding in the buildings above where the cellist is, trying to figure out where this guy is, and she sees him too late, and he takes a shot at her, and she manages to get out of the way and isn't killed, but she was then not useful anymore in protecting our cellist, and yet the guy didn't shoot him. She sort of lay there waiting to hear the second shot, and nothing. And this has been bugging her all day. She can't really figure out why that happened. There are some logical explanations for it, but nothing really satisfying. So where I pick up, it's the next day, and she's found a new hiding spot and is sort of there waiting for 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The day goes slowly. She hears heavy shelling to the west in the direction of Dobrnya and Moilamo. A part of her wishes she could be there. She thinks of the people who, because she has been here for the past 3 days, she has not shot. Men who hate her, men who would kill her, men who have killed people like her in the last 3 days because she did not kill them first. But then she begins to wonder even about this. Do the men on the hills hate her? Or do they hate the idea of her because she's different from them? And that in this difference there might be some sort of inferiority or superiority that is hers or theirs, that in the end threatens the potential happiness of everyone. She begins to wonder whether they fight against an idea, and that fight manifests itself as hatred. If so, they are no different from her, except for one key detail that simply can't be ignored or pushed aside. The idea she felt prepared to give her life for was not one that could include the hatred she feels for the men on the hills. The Sarajevo she fought for was one where you didn't have to hate a person because of what they were. It didn't matter what you were, what your ancestors had been, or what your children would be. You could hate a person for what they did. You could hate a murderer, you could hate a rapist, and you could hate a thief. This is what first drove her to kill the men on the hills, because they were all these things. But now she knows she's driven mainly by a hatred of them, the idea of them as a group, and not by their actions. This realization stuns her, and she feels an impulse to leave her rifle where it lies and return to her apartment. But she doesn't. She stays where she is. At 4 o'clock, the cellist comes out and her finger tightens around the trigger. The sniper shows himself almost immediately. He's in a second-story window, one of the 3 she first suspected. As the cellist begins to play, the sniper appears through a hole in the plastic, one that wasn't there before and isn't very well hidden. Arrow is surprised by how easy it is to spot him. The sniper puts the cellist in his sights. Arrow is about to send a bullet into him, but stops. His finger isn't on the trigger. This isn't a detail she would usually notice or care about, but she can see it in her scope, and it makes her pause. His hand isn't even in the vicinity of the trigger. His right hand holds the uppermost point of the stock, and his shot is clear, but his left hand isn't on his rifle. It hangs down to his side, out of her view. She wonders whether he can hear the music. He's not much farther from the cellist than she is, so he must. Does it sound the same to him? What does he hear? What does he think about, this man who sits in the street and plays? For several minutes, Arrow does nothing. She watches the sniper through the scope of her rifle and listens to the music lift off the street. It makes her sad, a heavy, slow kind of sad, the sort that does not bring you to tears but makes you feel like crying. It is, she thinks, the worst feeling there could be. Her finger is still on the trigger. If he moves, she will fire. But he does not move. The music is nearly finished, and he hasn't shifted a millimeter. She begins to doubt herself, wonders if he's real, if it's possible he's a decoy. But then he moves, and she knows what she sees is a person. His head leans back slightly, and she sees that his eyes are closed, that he's no longer looking through his scope. She knows what he's doing. It's very clear to her, unmistakable. He's listening to the music. And then Arrow knows why he didn't fire yesterday. She wants him to move his hand, to make a move that will decide for her what she will do, because she is at once sure of 2 things. The first is that she does not want to kill this man, and the second is that she must. Time is running out. There's no reason not to kill him. A sniper of his ability has, without doubt, killed dozens, if not hundreds. Not just soldiers, women crossing streets, children in playgrounds, old men in water lines. She knows this to a certainty, yet she doesn't want to pull her trigger. because she can see that he doesn't want to pull his. He hasn't moved. He still sits with his eyes closed, one hand on the stock of his rifle, the other at his side. The final notes of the cellist's melody reach him, and he smiles. His eyes open, and a small hole erupts between them. The back of his head disintegrates, and the gray viscous of his brain slaps onto the wall behind him. He falls from sight, and his rifle falls on top of him. Arrow lowers her rifle and looks down at the street. The cellist has finished. He picks up his cello and stool and heads for his door. He pauses just before he enters, and she wonders if he will look in her direction. Even though he can't possibly see her, she wants him to turn towards her, to acknowledge her in some way. The cellist adjusts his grip on his instrument and disappears into the building. So, I have come to believe very strongly that we have made, in the Western world at least, a fundamental mistake in our approach to the consumption of artistic expression. We have come to believe, and are told quite often, that engaging with works of art, be they books, paintings, films, whatever, is an elitist activity. It is something you do when your wallet is full and your stomach is full and the kids are put to bed and the important business of the day. It is a luxury and leisure item. My own mother, the mother of a novelist, very often uses to me the phrase artsy-fartsy. No matter how many times I say, "Mother, you are denigrating my existence as a human being," when you use that word, she does, and I don't think she's trying to be mean. She's actually just articulating the dominant view of what the role of the arts in society is. Now, this would be all fine and well, and please don't mistake what I'm saying for a plea for the role of the artist within society. We are going to do what we are going to do regardless. I didn't become a writer because I wanted to be a writer. I became a writer because it was not possible for me to be a functional human being otherwise. What I'm talking about, though, is what you all do with art. We have, at the same time, made a fundamental mistake in what we consider civilization to be. We have confused the benefits with the thing. We like to think that civilization is roads and bridges and buildings and stock markets and infrastructures and highways and this sort of thing. That's just dead wrong. Those are the things that civilization lets us have. Those are the spoils of the thing. What civilization is on a base level is an agreement we have to behave in certain ways towards each other. This agreement has evolved over however long we have been here, and I'm not getting into that. But it has been ongoing. And things like my hotel, the Elegante Hotel, has a statue of the Ten Commandments right when you walk in. And I've been thinking about this a lot. And the Ten Commandments, none of those are bad ideas. Maybe the Sabbath one, I think we need all 7 days now. But whether you choose to believe the Ten Commandments came from Moses on tablets, or we have just all over time agreed that thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, those are the two big ones, really, but the others are good too. We have agreed that if we wish to go forward as a civilization and produce some of these trappings, we're going to have to not do stuff like that. Now, we've codified it in laws, and we have sort of social strictures that keep these things in place. But what you find in the world is that Sarajevo is a great example of this. When the lights go off and the water stops running and the police miss a couple paychecks, we're kind of on our own, civilization-wise. and sort of back to it, the base thing civilization is an agreement we have to behave in certain ways towards each other. There are the big ones, like not killing, but there are even the small ones. You guys have, I think, a reasonable expectation that I am not at any point this evening going to hurl this water bottle into the audience. Is that illegal? Maybe a little. But the reason I'm not going to do it is because we have just kind of developed an agreement when you go to a thing in a theater that the presenter's not going to do stuff like that, right? Now, when these agreements break down, when the conversation gets stuck, the most indestructible way of beginning the conversation again or having a conversation about what is broken is consumption with artistic expression. When you see a play and something in it is sad or happy, that is an engagement with the world, right? If it's sad that Hamlet dies at the end or happy, depends on your worldview. If you were, rooting for his stepmother, then, you're like, ha, screw you, Hamlet. You got what was coming to you. You do not mess. Like, we've decided certain things. Now, here's a question I might ask you. If you were a dictator, what would you likely do right off the bat upon seizing power? Or what do good dictators do? They throw artists in prison. And the reason they do this is not only that we tend to be an immoral bunch, although statistically speaking, that is true. A lot of us are alcoholics. The reason they do this is because of what people will do if they engage with the product that we are creating. The artists are more capable of bringing a government down than the military. The military obviously does the last bit. But it's a way of having this conversation. And you see this in time and time again throughout history, people using artistic expression as a way to do this. The Cellist of Sarajevo, the actual Cellist of Sarajevo is one of dozens, if not hundreds of examples throughout history. Find me a war and I'll find you a Cellist of Sarajevo. In, I think it was 1940. Any historians here? When was the Luftwaffe bombing Stalingrad? I'm going to say 1942. All right, let's just say it was 1942. Composer David Ostra was playing a Tchaikovsky sonata in the town hall while it was being bombed. When the Russian tanks were going into Prague later on in the century, a man named Karel Kirill was standing in front of them with his guitar. There were a couple fellows, Gideon Klein and Pavel Haas, who put on plays and operas in Terezin, which was a transit camp to Auschwitz. Even in Sarajevo, there was a string quartet that would play at funerals. So many musicians were killed playing at funerals. You can have a funeral without music. It's been done. A graveyard's a terrible place to be in a sniper war because it's flat, right? But people did it anyway because these things are a way of saying, what is this deal we have that is civilization? Is this right, what is happening here? And if it's not, why not? What do we need to do to fix it? I feel like increasingly I don't know Europe as well, but Canada and North America, we are being told that this is actually not a real thing that we're doing, that this engagement. A great example is arts sections in newspapers. There used to be an arts section, now it's arts and entertainment. A review of an art opening is stuck in the back pages behind whatever starlet has forgotten to wear underpants lately. I would argue that latter story is a business story, not an arts story. Business can be awfully entertaining as well. Why isn't it business and entertainment? They made a movie about Bernie Madoff, so how is it this has happened? And I don't know how it's happened, but I do think that one of the things each of us can do, and one of the things each of the characters in the book do, is really think about what it is we're doing when we're engaging with the works of art that we choose to engage with. Obviously, we want entertainment. No one likes to be bored. And we want stories that resonate with us. But we are, when we're doing this, performing an essential act of civilization. And that's sort of one of the main things that the book is about. The book is about two main things. I'm going to move on to the second one because I feel correctly that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to read you two pieces. Yeah, I'm going to read you one piece and then the other piece. That's what I'll do. So I'm going to read from, and I apologize if you haven't read the book, I'm going to read from sort of near the end. And by sort of near the end, I mean the last two bits of the end. So if you want to sit there with your ears covered, I would normally find that a little weird, but in this particular instance, I will forgive you. And probably not a no, because actually those lights are bright and I can't see any of you. So the fellow I'm going to read from now is a man named Dragan, but I like to say Dragon because it's easier for me. Dragan is a older gentleman whose wife and son left Sarajevo in the early days of the war. But like many people, he was unsure as to whether there actually would be war, and leaving is kind of a big deal, right? Think about it right now. Say things get a little shaky here in these fine United States of America, and it's starting to look like Colorado might not be such a great place to be. At what point do you pack up and go? Is it when, I mean, if what happened here happened in Sarajevo, is it when the US Army surrounds Colorado and one day some journalists go out into the hills? Because the Army is saying, no, we're protecting Colorado. And then they go to the hills and they look and they realize, but all the guns are pointed at Colorado Springs. That's the wrong direction. Do you leave then? Do you wait for the first shots to be fired? Like, it was a hard thing for people in Sarajevo to know sort of when the right moment to leave was, because the reality was, well, then now you've lost your job. You know, if it turns out that it was no big deal, you're kind of screwed. So Dragan stayed, and he stayed long enough that then at a certain point, leaving was not an option. He works in the Sarajevo bakery, and the deal he has, as the employees of the Sarajevo bakery did, was even if they weren't working that day, if they could make it to the bakery, they could have a loaf of bread to eat, which was an enormous deal. The problem being for Dragan is that he's ended up stuck at this intersection where a sniper has been on it, and he can't get by. So he spends most of the book stuck there. And he ends up running into his friend Amina, who he hasn't seen for quite a while. And he has been scrupulously avoiding anyone he knew throughout the war, because he's found it, just as many people did, impossible to talk to anyone. You know, when you meet someone nowadays, the first thing you say is, how's it going? How you doing? And that's like an idiotic question in a siege situation. How are you doing? Well, I'm terrible. Like, when you lose small talk, you in a weird way lose the entry point to interact with people. So he goes out of his way. He will cross the street to avoid talking to people he knows, but he got stuck at the intersection, so he kind of had to talk to Amina. And she has been delivering medication. They had this thing where, you know, say, I could do this, but I can't see you. How many of you are on prescription medication right now? And many of you would put up your hands. Well, when your city's blockaded, you don't get it anymore. And a good percentage of you require this prescription medication to continue living. So what they would do is, on the radio, you would sort of write in and say, you know, Stephen Galloway needs this heart medication. If you happen to have some that you don't need because either, say, your father died or you just don't need everything, here is his address. Or phone in the radio and they would give you his address. So people would deliver medications to each other, sort of like an underground railroad of medication. So Amina's been doing this. Unfortunately, she got shot in the arm at one point, and Dragon ended up with her coat and thus her pill bottle. So I think I've now described the entire plot of Dragon to you, so I've just saved you 30% of reading the book. Oh no, I left a couple things out. There's a guy with a hat. Okay, so this is Dragon. There is no way to tell which version of a lie is the truth. Is the real Sarajevo the one where people were happy, treated each other well, lived without conflict? Or is the real Sarajevo the one he sees today, where people are trying to kill each other, where bullets and bombs fly down from hills and the buildings crumble to the ground? Dragon can only ask the question. He doesn't think there's any way to know for sure. It's past noon. He's been at this intersection for over 2 hours now. It seems like days. Stuck in a sort of no man's land, kept but not kept from going to the bakery where a small loaf of bread waits for him. He can cross whenever he likes. At no time has anyone come and said, "No, Dragan, you can't cross." It's always been his decision. He knows which lie he will tell himself. The city he lives in is full of people who will someday go back to treating each other like humans. The war will end, and when it's looked back upon, it will be with regret, not with fond memories of faded glory. In the meantime, he will continue to walk the streets, streets that will not have dead and discarded bodies lying in them. He will behave now as he hopes everyone will someday behave. Because civilization isn't a thing that you build and then there it is, you have it forever. It needs to be built constantly, recreated daily. It vanishes far more quickly than he ever would have thought possible. And if he wishes to live, he must do what he can to prevent the world he wants to live in from fading away. The cameraman has left, gone to a busier intersection. He needs people to take a chance and get shot or shot at, or if that doesn't happen, at least look like they think they're going to die. Eventually, the cameraman will get what he wants. It's only a matter of time. Dragan makes up his mind. He's going across. He's not going to let the men on the hills stop him. These are his streets, and he'll walk them as he sees fit. In a little less than 4 hours, the cellist will play for the final time. He adjusts his coat and shakes one foot, which has fallen partially asleep. The sky is beginning to cloud over and there's a slight chill in the air. He steps into the intersection. His shoes scuff on the pavement, and somewhere close by a car accelerates to a high pitch. A small bird flies overhead. Dragan is not running. He knows he should be, aware that the sniper is likely still in his perch. He could be in his sights right now. All it would take is a squeeze of a trigger, and he'd be dead. His feet don't respond to his mind's urgings. He can't run. At a leisurely pace, his body carries him across the road, past where Amina was shot, towards the other side. He could be walking down any street in the world. To a casual observer, he'd just be an old man out for a stroll. This is anything but the case. Dragan is terrified, has never been so afraid. But he can't force himself to move any faster. After a while, he stops trying. He keeps his eyes on the safe area he's heading toward, and he tries not to think about anything other than putting one foot in front of the other. He begins to understand why he isn't running. If he doesn't run, then he's alive again. The Sarajevo he wants to live in is alive again. If he runs, then it won't matter how many bodies lie in the streets. Perhaps the people watching him will think he's snapped, that he's gone catatonic and doesn't care anymore whether he lives or dies. They'd be wrong. He cares now more than ever. He's been asleep since the war began. He knows this now. In defending himself from death, he lost his grip on life. He thinks of Amina risking her life to deliver expired pills to someone she's never met. Of the young man who ran into the street to save her when she was shot. Of the cellist who plays for those killed in a mortar attack. He could run now, but he doesn't. He waits for gunfire, for the bullet that will hit him, but it never comes. He's both surprised and not surprised. There's just never any way to tell. It doesn't matter. If it comes, it will come. If it doesn't, he will be one of the lucky ones. Dragon reaches the opposite side of the road. It hasn't taken him long at all, but it seems a good portion of his life has gone by. It's a good thing the cameraman has gone. He knows he's created horrible television. An old man walking across a street with nothing happening. Hardly news. He walks west towards the bakery. He should be there in 10 more minutes. But then his hand feels a small plastic pill bottle and a scrap of paper with an address in his pocket, and he knows he'll be a little late. Still, no more than a half hour. He'll get his bread, and then he'll come back this way, whether the sniper's working or not. On his way home, he'll make a small detour to the street just south of the market and wait for 4 o'clock, so he can tell Amina what happened on the last day the cellist played. Dragon smiles as he passes by an elderly man. The man doesn't meet his gaze, keeps his eyes on the ground. "Good afternoon," Dragon says, his voice bright. The man looks up. He seems surprised. "Good afternoon," Dragon repeats. The man nods, smiles, and wishes him the same. Steve mentioned in his introduction a quote from his own review where he compared the book to Dickens. And I remember reading that, and I thought, I've read Dickens. It's an interesting comparison. I don't myself see it. And I've started to see, I think, a little what he was talking about, in that, in a weird way, this is a ghost story. All 3 of the characters are, in a weird way, ghosts. Arrow has become a bit of a ghost by being something she's not. She has made up this fictitious life for identity for herself of Arrow. That's not who she is. This is who she has become. She's sort of become a spirit inhabiting something else. Kenan, who has to go every 4 days and get water for his family from the brewery, has sort of, by the end of the book, is in danger of becoming a ghost by giving up on the things he believes you should do. The city, he's sort of the opposite of Dragon, in that Dragon is a ghost. He's dead. He's gone. He's just catatonic walking through it. And I like to think that by the end there, he sort of, like in Back to the Future, remember the movie Back to the Future? When Marty McFly finally solves the problem and he gets his substance back? Maybe that was a bad analogy for this particular speech. But it's like Dragon has got his substance back, and Kenan was in danger of losing it. But the second question, besides the role of artistic expression in the formation of civilization that the book asks is, how do you become a ghost, and what role does hatred play in that? And if we had another 2 hours, I could give you a lecture on how the war in the former Yugoslavia started. Or I could tell you this way. The war in Yugoslavia started because one group of people decided another group of people hated them, and through their actions made it true. We are extraordinarily cautious as people about our love. If I come up to any of you on the street and say, "Hey there, new friend who I've never met, you have kind eyes, and I love you." Now, you're not going to respond to me with love, right? You're not going to say, "Gee, guy, nice glasses, I love you too." That's not going to happen. We decide who we love. This is like one of the largest expressions of individualism we have come to nowadays. Hatred, though, as a related concept to love, the opposite of love is not hatred, it's apathy. But they're related, right? If I come up to you on the street and say, hey, jerk face, you smell like a dead fish, I hate you, what do you suppose the chances are that you're going to hate me back more than you would have loved me back in my first example? Much higher. Now, the problem with this is what we have done when we do that is abdicate our own interests. We have let another group of people decide for us how we will feel about them. And we don't like to do that. We really, Americans particularly, Canadians too, we don't like to be told how to feel about people. I'll decide how I feel about you. Unless you hate me, in which case I'm going to have to hate you back. I'm sorry, that's just... We need to watch this because you want to turn into a ghost. Hating someone because they hated you first is the quickest way to do it. And you end up in these intractable situations from which there is no end. Because once you've gone down the road, you don't back the road up. You then have to make a whole other road that turns around and gets you back there. But it's like the moving escalators in the airport. Escalators, sidewalks. You don't go anywhere. Arrow discovers this, and this is where I'm gonna, because look at that. I'm gonna end my talk is with just reading the final bit of Arrow. Sorry, Stephen, I'm over time by 4 minutes. I blame you and your unreasonably long introduction. Okay. Arrow blinks. She has been waiting for a long time. She slept well, didn't wake even once during the night. There's one sound she's been listening for, and it's here. Footsteps echo in the hall outside her door, heavy boots coming up the stairs. They're making an effort to be quiet, but the stairwell isn't helping, its acoustics unaccommodating to the aims of men requiring stealth. Arrow opens her eyes. It's still early in the morning, not quite 7 o'clock. It's been 10 days since she walked away from Hassan on the 14th floor of the Parliament building. 10 days since she deserted Eden Karaman's unit of murderers. This is the first night she's slept in her apartment since then, and already they've found her. She's a little surprised. She didn't imagine they'd be so efficient. Her father's gun is on the bedside table beside her. It's loaded and ready, but her hand stays at her side under her pile of blankets. She wonders what the weather will be like today. Yesterday it seemed it might rain, but there's never any way to tell what will happen the next day until it comes. She hopes it rains. The city could use the water. They've been hunting her for 10 days now, and they have found her because she has allowed them to. They knew where she was all along, knew she was in one of the buildings above the Cellist, but they couldn't find her, no matter how many times they looked. Twice she had Eden Karaman's head in her sights, but she never pulled the trigger. She hasn't fired her rifle since killing the sniper the men on the hills sent for the Cellist. But she would have, if necessary, and she believes her presence kept him alive. He played for 22 days, just as he said he would. Every day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, regardless of how much fighting was going on around him. Some days he had an audience. Other days there was so much shelling that no one in their right mind would linger in the street. It didn't appear to make any difference to him. He always played exactly the same way. The only variation in his routine was on the last day. She lay concealed in her hiding spot, invisible. She felt him enter the street, but before he began to play, she knew no one was going to shoot him. The men on the hills had given up. Her hands relaxed and her finger fell from the trigger. As the cellist began to play, she looked down at the street. It was full of people. No one moved. They all stood motionless, and though it was clear to her that they were listening intently, it also seemed as though they weren't entirely there. Arrow let the slow pulse of the vibrating strings flood into her. She felt the lament raise a lump in her throat, fought back tears. She inhaled sharp and fast. Her eyes watered and the notes ascended the scale. The men on the hills, the men in the city, herself, none of them had the right to do the things they'd done. It had never happened. It could not have happened. But she knew these notes. They had become a part of her. They told her that everything had happened exactly as she knew it had, and that nothing could be done about it. No grief or rage or noble act could undo it. But it could all have been stopped. It was possible. The men on the hills didn't have to be murderers. The men in the city didn't have to lower themselves to fight their attackers. She didn't have to be filled with hatred. The music demanded that she remember this, that she know to a certainty that the world still held the capacity for goodness. The notes were proof of that. Arrow closed her eyes, and when she opened them, the music was over. In the street, the cellist sat on his stool for a very long time. His head leaned forward, and a few strands of inky hair fell across his brow. One hand moved to cover his face, while the other cradled the body of the cello. After a while, he stood up, and he walked over to the pile of flowers that had been steadily growing since the day the mortar fell. He looked at it for a time, and then dropped his bow into the pile. No one on the street moved. They held their breath, waiting for him to say something. But the cellist didn't speak. He turned, picked up his stool, and went through the door to his apartment without looking back at the street. Slowly, people began to move, and one by one they left the street to return to their lives. The footsteps are at the top of the stairs now, just outside her door. Arrow looks again at the gun on her night table. If she were to use it, she knows exactly what would happen. The men on the other side of the door would die. Every one of them would die, and she'd step over their bodies and out into the street. It would take only a few seconds. It would be the easiest thing in the world. But she isn't going to pick up the gun. It sits on the night table, partly out of habit, and partly because she wants them to know that she was armed and could have fought back. She's not sure they'll notice this clue. It doesn't matter. It only matters that she leaves it. She wonders what her life might have been like if there had been no war, if the men on the hills hadn't decided that they needed to be reviled, or that the answer to their aspirations of victimhood lay in guns and tanks and grenades. Maybe she'd have gotten married. Maybe she'd have gone on to graduate school, had a good job, lived in a nice apartment, and gone to the theater in the evenings with her friends. There could have been children. She likes children, or she used to. The possibilities were endless. The possibilities now, however, are at an end. If she picks up the gun and kills the men on the other side of the door, she will become a fugitive. And sooner or later, she will either have to kill again, or she will be caught. In the meantime, necessity will force her to hate her pursuers. And Arrow will not let that happen. Whether they are on the hills or in the city, no one will tell her who to hate. After the cellist disappeared, Arrow went down to the street, not caring whether anyone saw her. She looked at the cobblestones, the shattered windows, the pile of flowers. She couldn't think of anything she hadn't already gone over 1,000 times. So she just stood there. The cellist wouldn't be back tomorrow. There would be no more concerts in the street. She was disappointed it was over. Arrow leaned down and placed her rifle beside the cellist's bow. In a few seconds, the door will open. At least 4 men, maybe more, will burst through, and as quickly as they can, they will fire as many bullets into her as possible. It won't take long, only a few seconds, and afterwards they will feel sheepish at how nervous they were about the whole thing. She hears one of them take a step back, knows he's about to kick in the door. She closes her eyes, recalls the notes she heard only yesterday, a melody that is no longer there, but feels very close. Her lips move, and a moment before the door splinters off its hinges, she says, her voice strong and quiet, "My name is Alissa." Thank you very much for listening. Yeah, I think we're going to do some questions now. Yes? Yes. If you have any. If you don't, that's all right. Don't be afraid. They say there's no such thing as a stupid question, only a stupid answer. So, if anything, the pressure's on me. Yes. I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear. The question was, what was the disagreement between me and Vedran Smilovich? The disagreement was over whether did it just get echoier in here? Ooh, hello. The disagreement was about whether, as a writer of fiction, I am entitled to talk about things that take place on public streets in the real world without paying for it. He felt very strongly that because I used the phrase the Cellist of Sarajevo, which he has sort of taken on as a moniker, even though John Burns of the New York Times came up with it, and because, when you guys buy a book, I get like $1.50, that I should pay him for having written about him. I take the position that the moment writers have to pay to talk about things that happen in the world, we're done. So we've agreed to disagree on that. I've tried very hard to sort of make friends, because I'm Canadian, and I can, and the consular people can back me up. I can be kicked out of Canada for not being friendly towards people. It's a law. I went to Ireland to try to sit down. He lives in Ireland. I went to Ireland to try to sit down with him, and I would go again in a heartbeat if he wanted me to. But he's decided that I'm a jerk. So we've agreed to disagree about that too. So yeah, it's always a tricky thing though, writing a story that involves people who are still alive. Generally, the bar is don't libel or slander them. It's rare to upset someone by writing a book in which they look very good. Others? No? Oh, there is one. Sorry, I didn't see you back there. Oh, would you like me to give you the gist of it? Okay, yeah, the question is how much time did I spend in Sarajevo? While working on the book, I only spent about a month there. The main way I researched the book was, other than doing the normal things writers do, which is reading all the books I could find and watching sort of video news footage, was I befriended a large number of Sarajevans in Vancouver and a couple in Seattle nearby who had lived through the war. A lot of Sarajevans who lived through the war ended up having to leave after the war because just economically they couldn't stay. And I would just get them to talk to me, basically I would take them out to dinner and keep the food and wine a-flowing and put down my tape recorder and then try to become invisible and just listen to them tell stories, the way families tell stories. And they would tell each other their versions of this story. Like the bit I read about Dragon, and I didn't set it up right, but there had been a cameraman there previously who, when people crossed the road and they didn't get shot, the cameraman looked disappointed, right? Because he was there to get the footage of someone getting shot, and in defense of him, the longer he was out there trying to get that footage, the higher the chances he would become the footage. But like everyone I talked to told me a version of that story, and I ended up sort of with these not universal stories, but very close to it, that if you had lived through the siege, chances are you would have had, which I never would have known to ask someone if I was doing it in a conventional sort of journalist type interview where you had a list of questions. And then after I'd done all that, I then went to Sarajevo and discovered all the things I'd done wrong because of geography and whatnot. But yeah. Oh, it's much better, absolutely. I was there in 2010, I want to say, with a British TV crew. They made me walk up and down a hill repeatedly, looking thoughtful for later voiceover. But one of the things they wanted to do was interview me in front of a wall with bullet holes in it, and I didn't really want to do it, but you can't, TV people just tell you what you're doing. And we had to drive around for hours before we could find one, in terms of physically rebuilding the city, they've done a pretty good job. The economy is still pretty wretched. The last time I was there, the employment was like 30 some odd %, which is not great, but it's much better. It's actually, if any of you ever get a chance to go there, I really encourage you. It's a remarkable place to visit, and entirely safe, and very interesting and generous people. So yes. I will give you the 2 polls of responses I have gotten. Some are letters which go like this: my father was one of your wretched men on the hills who you so vilify, and he didn't come home. Maybe your children would like it if one day you didn't come home. Stuff like that. And then on the flip side, I had an experience which is, maybe one of the best experiences I will never have a better experience as a writer, but maybe something will be good. Was at a reading, I don't remember where it was, but it was obviously somewhere. And very often I do readings, and there will, Bosnian men often have angry face, where they're not actually angry, but they have resting angry face, and I'll be doing the reading and I'll see someone, and it will feel to me like they're just like trying to burn a hole through the back of my skull. And there was a guy there who was particularly skull-burny. And I did my reading and I did my thing, and I tried not to let it get to me. But afterwards I was signing books and he was sort of lingering, and I thought, oh, this guy's gonna yell at me for something. I don't know what, but he looks mad. And he came up and he had about a 16-year-old boy with him who looked like he really didn't want to be there. Like, he looked like he thought, oh man, Dad's gonna do it again. He looked embarrassed, but the guy actually then reached into his bag and pulled out a book, and he said, I am like your character Dragon. I sent my boy here away when the war started, and we've never talked about the war, but I read your book, and will you sign a copy of it to him so that he can read it and know what it was like in a way. And I thought, oh my God, for a guy who makes a living telling lies, which is what fiction is, you just had a good day. So, like anything, there's always going to be a really wide range of interpretations. I'm sure there are some Sarajevans. I had a run-in with a guy when I was there named Nenad Velishkovich, a Sarajevan writer, terrific writer. And a mutual friend took us to have a coffee, and I thought, oh, this will be fun. We'll have a writer chat for being writers from different cultures. It'll be great. I'm excited about it. I was looking forward to it for days. And we got there, and he went up one side of me and down the other. And he said, I don't come to Canada and write stories about moose and winter and igloos. So why have you come to Sarajevo to write a book about my war? You could move here now and live here for the rest of your life, and you will never know what it was like. You will never know what every nuance of Bosnian culture means. Like, there is so much you will never, ever know. And he was right. And I sort of sat there shell-shocked for a minute because, I've always, you're aware of voice appropriation stuff and arguments, and I had been myself feeling a little about, how am I going to navigate this? Because he's right. I don't know anything. And what I realized in that moment and said to him was, you're right, but being an outsider actually gives me a position that is different. There have been lots of books written about the war in Sarajevo by people who have lived through it. One of the finest, Alexander Hemon from Chicago, like, better writer than I am, and written about it. But I don't know the things that most of the people who read my books don't know. I know when I'm confused in a situation. And for me, writing a book about this subject is an act of translation. When a person who lived through it is writing about it, it's an act of communicating their experience. For me, it's translating experiences of people or fictional characters in a not fictional setting over. And in a way, being an outsider gives me a position that can be an advantage because, Nenad, you don't know what I don't know. And to my amazement, this may be the only time anyone has ever won an argument with a Bosnian. Because he said, oh, and they said, all right, then that seems reasonable. And we went for a nice walk, and we bought a bottle of wine, and we're friends to this day. But yeah, that was a long-winded answer to that question. Sorry. Is there anything else? Or, oh, yes. Nerman Philip, yeah, not directly, but one of the things that did happen in the defense of Sarajevo. Sorry, the question was whether the character of Nerman was based on anyone literally. Yes and no. There were lots of them. What happened was, one of the problems they had in Sarajevo was that was their own army against them. So, Sarajevo itself didn't have much of an army. They had a couple units had defected, but it was mostly a civilian defense force. And one of the necessary but ultimately blunderous movements in the beginning of the war is they let all the criminals out of jail because they knew how to fight. And then they sort of lost control of them, and they managed to get a couple. But what happened as the war progressed is the Sarajevans who were saying, I don't care whether a person is Serb, Muslim, Croat, Jew, whatever. That's not part of my identity. They started to get drowned out by a faction there that said, if the Serbs are going to shoot at us, we're going to shoot at them. And the only good Serb is a dead Serb. And there was a paramilitary group called Sivas, which means the Larks in Bosnian, began shooting civilians in Grbavica the way, sort of an eye for an eye kind of idea. And Nerman was sort of based on that phenomenon. I think by the end of the war they managed to get rid of most of that, but I don't really know for sure because people won't talk about it there, because if you do, you end up in The Hague for war crimes. So anyway, I think maybe we've been here long enough. What do you guys think? Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Stephen Galloway, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Stephen, so much. We're going to end the evening with a piece of music again, so bear with us for just a moment. It's my pleasure to introduce again Pam Chadden and Robin Kessinger. want to thank Pam and Robin one more time, and as they continue, if you want to make your way out to our book signing, thank you very much. Once again, thank you, Stephen Galloway. Pam and Robin, have a beautiful evening, ladies. Robin Kissinger and Pam Chadden, thank you so much. There is information on their piece at the table up front where Stephen is. You can pick that up on your way out. Plus, they are 2/3 of Trio Paradis, and there is a piece for their next concert at the table as well. Please help yourself. Thank you once again for coming, and thank you once again for participating in All Pikes Peak Reads. And thank you, Chamber Orchestra of the Springs, for supplying this beautiful music this evening.